Say hello and welcome to everyone to this monthly edition of our BioBites. This is our June series. We are talking today about heart rate variability and why heart rate variability matters. My name is Jessica Frank. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome, thumbs up. I'm the Biomed Program Manager at the Marion Institute. And for those of you who are new to a BioBites presentation, BioBites is the Marion Institute's monthly virtual educational series. And the BioBites program connects you with some of the foremost experts in alternative health, natural healing, and biological medicine today, speaking on key topics relating to wellness and empowered health. So first, before we begin our presentation, we have a few housekeeping items. Please just keep mics muted during the presentation. We are recording. And second, we encourage people, the interactive portion is through the chat. So we encourage you to open up your chat. And as we go through the presentation, maybe drop in a question or two as we're going through. We answer those questions in the second half, just so you know. So we're staying abreast of all that's in the chat. Third, I'll go ahead and announce what our next and upcoming BioBites are. We are going to skip July this year. It actually falls on 4th of July, so no BioBites for July. August BioBites, it's the 1st of August. It's with epigeneticist and healer Christine Dionese, speaking about epigenetics and health. And then earmark September 5th, we're bringing back physician Dr. Dixon Tom to discuss the metabolic theory of cancer. So we'll really want to pay attention to that one. Make sure you're getting our emails, signing up for those, or following us on socials to register. And again, we're going to be recording this. So when we're done here in the next week or so, we're going to send you the recording. You'll also get some resources in a few days after that. So tons of opportunities to reconnect. So let me describe what we're talking about today, heart rate variability, what it is and how it relates to health outcomes and longevity. So helping us dive deeper into HRV is Guy Odishaw. He is the founder of Bhakti Wellness Center, one of the largest, most diverse integrative medicine clinics in the country, co-founder of the first integrative student health clinic in the country at University of Minnesota, and he's co-founder of the Bhakti Brain Health Clinic for neuroimaging and neuromodulation. He's also the co-founder of the Minnesota Bredesen Clinic for dementia prevention and treatment. Most recently, he is co-founder of CerebralFit Brain Training. He has 30 years of clinical experience, specializing in treatment-resistant chronic pain, traumatic brain injury, and psycho-emotional trauma. And psycho-emotional trauma informs his approach to brain health. Also, he has 20 years as a meditation instructor and facilitator of courses on personal growth. And that helps him understand his clients' potent changes that arise from neurofeedback and brain training. So, how about this? Without further delay, let me click some buttons here to bring on Guy Odishaw. So I'll take it away, Guy.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica. And I'm realizing whenever I do this, that over the 30 years, my biography just keeps growing. And I just need to pare that down a little bit. Well, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to come and talk about heart rate variability, something that is near and dear to me and has become just a central part of my practice. So to start off, maybe we'll kind of start with a more generic description, a little historic take on heart rate variability. And then at some point, I'm gonna put up on the screen a couple of case studies, and we'll actually take a look at clinic level HRV as we do it in the clinic. And I'll kind of walk you through some of the metrics so you get a sense of it happening, connected with a real person. And we'll talk through a little bit of their case history, what brought them in, what do the findings show, and then kind of tie that into how can you do a at-home HRV practice at a very simple low-tech level, and then maybe why might you want to consider looking at doing HRV at a clinic level at least one time for what's called a resonant frequency determination. But hopefully by the end of this, all of that will make sense. And then of course, we're gonna have time at the end for question and answer. So anywhere along the line, please feel free to post questions. If Jessica feels that that is relevant to where we are in the conversation, Jessica, feel free to interrupt me with any clarifying questions around terminology I might use. So heart rate variability, what it is, we're all familiar with a heartbeat, and we think of our heartbeat as, I have 60 beats per minute or 70 beats per minute or 80 beats per minute, what my resting heart rate is. Heart rate variability is the difference in the time between beats. So our heart should not beat like a metronome in that, let's say you have a 60 beats per minute, so your heart is beating every second. That's actually not healthy to have your heart beating at a consistent pace, beat to beat. So we want to see interbeat variability. So that's what heart rate variability is a measure of, is maybe your heart beats, in 1 second, and then in 1.5 seconds, and then in 3/4 of a second. And so that time between beats is variable. Right. And so why that matters is this is really all about the autonomic nervous system, and heart rate variability is kind of a window into the autonomic nervous system. So our that heartbeat variability is a timing between our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic, or what they call the vagal brake, which withdraws sympathetic innervation of the heart. And so simple way to think about it is, when we inhale, if all is going well, when we inhale, that is a sympathetic nervous system activity, and our heartbeat should speed up. And when we exhale, that's a parasympathetic nervous system activity, and the vagal brake should engage, withdraw sympathetic stimulation of the heart, and the heartbeat slows down. So our heartbeat increases when we inhale and decreases when we exhale. That's what should happen. And that's telling us something about what's happening in our autonomic nervous system in the balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? So heart rate variability is a window into that. And why that matters for overall health is our autonomic nervous system is running a lot of our internal processes. So our breathing, our heartbeat, our digestion, our general organ function is all being run by our autonomic nervous system. And what we want is that to be highly attuned to our need. So what's happening in the moment? So if I'm sitting doing relatively nothing, like maybe a podcast, there's not a lot of a metabolic demand. So my autonomic nervous system should be kind of down regulating the activity. So my heart isn't pumping as hard. My demand for oxygen is lower. So my breathing is changing to meet the metabolic demand. If I were to get up and walk across the room, I would want that to change. If I had to, suddenly get up and run outside and grab one of my dogs and bring them in the house, and so I needed to suddenly move into action and then back into rest, I would want my autonomic nervous system to be able to respond to that as acutely as possible, right? So as specifically as possible to meet the demand when I need it, and then slow things back down as I come back to rest. So when our autonomic nervous system is doing that across all of our organs, now here we're talking about the heart and, so our cardiac rhythm and our respiratory rhythm. But again, that's a window into the broader function. So it's the same of when I eat food, I want my digestive system to turn on kind of in stages to process that food. When I'm regulating my water balance, so I need my kidneys to be doing so much work at such time, I need that to be matched to the metabolic demand. And so when our autonomic nervous system is functioning well, it's very well attuned to our metabolic demand. Great, we call that health. As our autonomic nervous system gets out of sync with itself, then we don't meet our metabolic demand in such a precise way. And then that leads to kind of a degradation of health, which over time can lead to kind of serious health conditions. So one of the things that is said about HRV is back kind of in the 70s and has been, continually proven true through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Our data has gotten better on it, but there are enormous pools of data telling us that HRV, so heart rate variability, becomes one of our best predictors of what's called all-cause mortality, so death. And we know that there's a strong correlation between a very low heart rate variability and an increased risk of death, and a high heart rate variability gives you a longer life expectancy in terms of actuarial charts and when a person would be anticipated to pass. But the same thing can be said for significant life impinging illnesses. So coronary artery disease, stroke, dementia, diabetes, cancer. So lower heart rate variability is a predictor for having a major health event. So that goes right into that same, because obviously major health events often lead to higher mortality. So those two things are connected. So it is to say that we can look at a person's heart rate variability and we can't say what condition they might have in the future. We just know that their risk is greatly amplified of having a major health incident if their HRV is low. So this is kind of the why is heart rate variability important. This is the major reason, is because it's a sign telling us that our autonomic nervous system is not meeting our moment-to-moment metabolic demands very well, and over time that is going to erode our health. So then we know the opposite is true. Working on our heart rate variability or working on our autonomic nervous system is protective for our health over time. And so I would say that's the big story of heart rate variability, is the future you, the you of 5 years, the you of 10 years, the you of 20 years in the future. That you is going to be having fewer health complications if you keep your heart rate variability high or autonomic harmony high. So we know that heart rate variability is the beat to beat change in our heart rate, and that is to do with our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and the balance there, which again, we're using the heart as a window into what's happening in the larger system. So some of the ways that people will encounter this in just kind of the broader consumer culture is wearables, right? So today wearables are pretty ubiquitous, whether it's a ring or a watch or a chest strap. Most commonly are probably the watches, the Apple Watches, the Fitbits, the various trackers. And so these are kind of bringing HRV into just kind of normative culture, right? It's very common for people to have some type of wearable where they're tracking their HRV. So one of the things that I want to talk about today is the difference between that kind of HRV and then what we look at a clinic level. And as we get into the presentation and you see what we do in the clinic, I think it will become obvious the difference between what's happening with a wearable and what's happening with in the clinic, and why there's a very large spectrum of what HRV actually is, what heart rate variability actually is, in terms of how it's talked about in the wearable market versus how we talk about it at the clinic level. And although they have the same name, heart rate variability, they are not the same things. And so one of the challenges is in the wearable market is their ability to take data, right? So they're extracting data from the body. Mostly what they're taking is heart rate data. And so it's sampling heart rate data and then making all kinds of predictions based on that. And so, for example, it's using heart rate to predict when you're inhaling and when you're exhaling, because as I mentioned before, ideally your heart rate will go up when you inhale and go down when you exhale. And so the wearable is noticing an increase in heart rate and it's saying, oh, that was an inhale, and then a decrease in heart rate, that was an exhale. So it doesn't actually know when you're breathing, it's just using your heart rate data to predict that. So one of the big differences is in the clinic, we are measuring a person's actual respiration rate. So one of the case studies we're going to see is a person who their cardiac rhythm and respiratory rhythm were anti-correlated. So when they inhaled, their heart slowed, and when they exhaled, their heart sped up. So that's the opposite of how it should be. That's a very dysregulated autonomic nervous system. But this is a person who had a wearable who their wearable was telling them that they were doing really well, that their autonomic function was good, their HRV was good, but it wasn't. It was completely the opposite of good. And so this is an extreme example, but it points to a pretty big problem, which is the wearables are fine for people who are healthy. They are not really that helpful for people who have health concerns and want to know for reasons of their health and well-being what's happening in their autonomic nervous system. And the data is just too unreliable because there aren't enough individual measures to put together an actual accurate prediction of what's happening in the system. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll go ahead and move into the presentation that I have for you. We'll do a little orientation to the screen, what you're going to see, what those mean, and then we'll kind of walk through the case studies, come out the other side, and then maybe there will be some questions. And so let's.
Feel free to follow along, everybody, and just as you're going through it, just if you have a question, just put it in the chat.
Try that screen share again. There we go. Great. Good. Okay, so you should all be seeing it's a shot of a computer screen. And the first part of this, I actually, on the video, will kind of narrate for you. So for a little bit here, for a few minutes, you're going to be listening to me on the video, and I will be, with the little magic pen, I'll be indicating what the different meters mean, and just kind of giving you an orientation to not only this person, but some of the metrics on the screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and let that play.
It's an interesting case of a stress response in the midst of a heart rate variability resonant frequency determination. So this is where we look for the optimal breathing rate for the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system to come into balance. This person came into the clinic, presented 40-year-old, healthy, athletic, but having a difficult time staying asleep at night. Falls asleep fine, sleeps till about 4 in the morning, wakes up, sometimes can get back to sleep, sometimes cannot get back to sleep, has tried any number of interventions to change this pattern, but has been unsuccessful across all of them. So I suggested we take a look at the parasympathetic nervous system and just see how it's doing. And the first part of this video you're going to see is a few minutes of the resonant frequency determination, and I'll just walk you through some of the metrics on the screen. But one of the things that tipped me off that maybe something was up, the resonant frequency determination is about 25 minutes long. It takes people through different breath rates, and that's usually mildly stressing. And so we see some wobble in the nervous system as it's being asked to switch from slower to faster paces of breathing. And this person was pretty much perfect all the way through. So I call this the performer, right? That person who just has the ability in most situations to perform perfectly for that circumstance. So in this case, they performed perfectly for their resonant frequency determination. And that, again, made me suspicious. So I asked them if they'd be open to do a little additional stress test. So a few minutes in, you're going to see that the screen changes, and that's where we went from the resonant frequency when we finished that into another HRV screen with all the same metrics, but it'll look a little different. And the stressor that I asked them to evoke was just a memory of the last time that they woke up at night. So not a traumatic memory, nothing particularly stressful, just to bring back the memory and the feeling that came along with the last time they woke up at 4 in the morning and wasn't able to get back to sleep. So that was the stressor. And you're going to see in the HRV readings when that moment happens. You'll also notice, and I'll point out, that there is a stress response taking place just knowing that they're going to be asked to bring up a memory. So they know that it's coming, but they were asked not to go into it until I gave them the cue. And then we'll see the moment they kind of go into the memory, how their sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system loses the plot. So I will start the video and then talk you through a few of the metrics. Okay, so here you'll see that's the breath pacer right now. They're breathing at 5 breaths per minute. Over here, the spectral display, we're getting a nice spectral reading in around 0.6, which is great. Coherence, you'll see that they're running at about 100%. So that's what we see right here, where the respiratory rate and the heart rate variability are very much in line with one another. They're actually, heart rate variability is doing pretty good, running around 15. Their skin conductance here, just a little under 1, which is great. Blood volume pulse up around 50, so they've got good peripheral blood flow. And here, peripheral temperature at about 93 degrees, which is, again, great. So all of this is moving along nicely. We notice that their heart rate is fairly low. They're moving between a range of 60 and 75 beats per minute. So the system is doing well. Now you see we'll switch over to do this additional stress test. One of the first things you'll notice, their temperature is dropping. So a sign of stress. Skin conductivity has gone up. Another sign of stress. Sweat in the skin becoming more conductive. The blood volume pulse has dropped off from 50 to 25. So again, we're seeing constriction in the capillaries. We'll notice here, coherence is down. They're still at a pretty good number. We're going to see that drop even more. Heart rate variability is doing okay, but starting to fall. So all of their metrics are starting to show that there is a subtle stress in the system. Now, one of the things, if we were only looking at coherence, we might think this person is still doing okay, but having temperature and skin conductivity and blood volume pulse gives us an indication that this system is under distress. So coming up here shortly, you're going to start to notice this green trace, which is their respiration, and this red trace, which is their heart rate variability, are going to start to diverge quite extremely. And that is the moment at which I ask them to evoke the memory of the last time they were not able to sleep at night. And we see that happening right now. And we notice they fall off their breathing rhythm, their heart rate variability narrows, the coherence between inhalation and exhalation has dropped away. There's almost no coherence between the two, which means the parasympathetic and the sympathetic and parasympathetic are not having a strong relationship to the cardiac system right now. And so the autonomics are in distress. And temperature falling here, we see kind of hitting a peak in skin conductivity. Again, stress response, a slight sweating. So a very interesting case of the person who is able to maintain good sympathetic, parasympathetic, or autonomic nervous system balance through a mild stress test. But then when asked to bring to mind a mild stressor, right, a disrupted night of sleep, that the autonomic nervous system just loses the plot and goes into a stress response.
So for this video, there is no voiceover, so I'm going to step in. What you're looking at here is this person's actually doing neurofeedback while doing biofeedback. So on the screen, you might recognize that off in the distance. They're looking at the same screen that you were just looking at. Just happens to be that I also have a full 19 channel of EEG to kind of see what their brain is up to while I'm looking at what their autonomic nervous system is up to. So some of the things to notice here, again, that red trace, the cardiac rhythm, and the green trace, the respiratory rhythm. You'll notice here they're not in sync. The coherence, we're at zero coherence right there. And there's moments when they are just barely making the zero, but more time when they're below zero. So it's that kind of anti-correlated between the sympathetic and parasympathetic.
Hey, Guy.
Yep.
I'm hearing those chimes. I think
yes.
your.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, they're lovely, but.
Yes. So that's a breath pacer to help the client know when to inhale and when to exhale. But yes, thank you for reminding me to get that out of the audio. So we can see here, again, their peripheral blood flow is very low. So we have peripheral vascular constriction, so we don't have good blood flow to the extremities. Their temperature here is starting to rise, but that's actually because their temperature was getting so low, I needed to cover them with a blanket to start getting a little bit of warmth back into the body. Our equipment, if they get too cold, actually won't be able to get a good signal. So we're into a second session here. So I will say a little bit about this person as we kind of watch their metrics kind of improve over a series of trainings. They came in originally for treatment-resistant depression. So they had had chronic depression pretty much certainly their whole adult life, but also into their childhood. One of the things that we had found when we did our neuroimaging was signs of a traumatic brain injury. In questioning them, they reported no history of concussion, but eventually we were able to pull out that, sure enough, as a teenager, they'd had a significant head injury, although no diagnosis of a concussion, and so they had no sense of it. But indeed, the neuroimaging showed a very strong, it was like a 95% correlation to traumatic brain injury. So we switched from treating her for depression to treating for traumatic brain injury. And as part of that, as often happens in concussion, there's an impact on the autonomic nervous system. So that's what led me to take a look at her autonomic system. And sure enough, we see that her autonomics are really in a terrible condition. And so we do neurofeedback to address the concussion and the biofeedback to address the autonomic nervous system. And those two things actually start moving her out of her decades-long chronic depression back to a point when we stop in-clinic treatment. She basically says she feels better and is functioning better than she ever has in her life, and is now just kind of on at-home training to continue. So a couple of things that we see now that we're by into session 4, we see that her peripheral temperature is up. Her peripheral circulation, no surprise, is also up. So that's a dramatic improvement from where she started. Still struggling with coherence, but is actually doing better. We're starting to see a repair in that mechanism of cardiac rhythm and respiratory rhythm starting to have a relationship to one another. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier, some of you might have noticed this reading, the heart rate variability, initially was actually very high, and now is low by comparison. The reason it was high before was her heart was really kind of chaotic. It was not following any kind of coherent rhythmic pacer. And so her heartbeat was all over the place. And so now that we've started to reintroduce her heart into her autonomic nervous system, we're getting a truer reading here. Here you're seeing now her coherence is much better. You can start to see these two plots here, respiration and cardiac, following each other, which is what we want to see. So this is fantastic change. Again, temperature is up, peripheral circulation, volume of circulation is up. So really all of her measures are dramatically improved from where we started. And so this is, her autonomic nervous system has had the opportunity to kind of relearn how to be in sync with itself. And then we see this playing out in her life in terms of better sleep, more resilience, again, changes in her symptoms of depression, but also more just general sense of kind of well-being and engagement more broadly in life, being a better performance at work, multiple areas kind of improving. So I'm gonna stop there. Okay. So you can see in the clinic, we're taking 10 different measures and kind of correlating those measures to tell us a story of what's happening in this autonomic nervous system. So things like skin conductance, peripheral circulation, temperature, those are really helpful. They're run by different parts of the autonomic nervous system. So we can have multiple windows into the system. One part might be doing well, but another part might not be doing well. And so again, if our equipment was more limited, or if a person is using a wearable where you're really probably collecting just one metric and maybe two metrics, it's hopefully you start to get the idea that having one piece of data just isn't enough to tell what's happening in the autonomic nervous system. Right? So if we go to our first case study, that person had near perfect coherence. So if we were looking at coherence as our measure of autonomic health, we would have been completely misled. And we see this a lot in the clinic. When people come in with a wearable that is maybe collecting two pieces of information, it's collecting heart rate and breath rate. So we have those two. So that gives us coherence as a measure. It's remarkably easy for people to have a good coherence and have their autonomic nervous system be in a great deal of distress. So we find coherence is worth having as a measure, but not as an only measure. We need to have more data points to be able to back that up, to say, how is this system doing overall? And again, we could see in our second case study, which is a great example of what on a wearable would look like really good HRV. And indeed, she felt that she was very healthy in that area of her life. Only when we looked at it from a clinic level, we found out that the complete opposite was true. So I see a couple of questions popping in, and so I'm more than happy to address those now. And so one of the questions was, can I say a difference between neurofeedback and biofeedback? Sure. So on one level, the terms are actually within the profession, they're interchangeable. We could say like a technical difference would be neurofeedback is when we're tracking data from the brain, and biofeedback is when we're tracking data from the body. So if we're taking heart rate data or temperature data or respiration data, that's all body-based metrics, and so that's biofeedback. When we have sensors on the head and we're looking at EEG, or the electrical activity produced by firing neurons, that's neurofeedback. So that's the technical difference between the two. But again, within the profession, we can tend to be a little sloppy and just use one name for all of it. And I'll just say, from a medical standpoint, on the insurance side, insurance pretty much, for the most part, not 100%, but 90%, will only pay for biofeedback. So that's another reason why within the profession, people will only talk about biofeedback and not neurofeedback, just simply conventions of healthcare medical billing. And I'm happy to say more if there are more questions in that specific divide. Another one of the questions was, how are we measuring coherence, and how does that differ between HRV as a predictor of autonomic nervous system dynamics? So coherence is the correlation between when we inhale, our heart speeds up, and when we exhale, our heart slows down. So coherence is like how soon in time, so time domain measure of when I start to inhale, how soon does my heart start to speed up? And when I start to exhale, how soon does my heart start to slow down? So that timing, when we saw on the coherence measure the 100%, that's telling us that those are lined up in time, virtually at the same time. As those two graphs get out of sync, that's telling us that there's a phase lag between when I inhale and when my heart responds. And then we got the extreme other opposite, which is why I like these two case studies together. We have the person who is inhaling and their heart is slowing down. And so we have essentially an inverse effect. So that's the measure, is we're looking at so using a respiration strap and what's called a plethysmograph, or a blood volume pulse measuring device to pick up heart rate and blood volume at the periphery. But the same thing could be done with EKG to pick up heart rate. We just generally in the clinic don't do EKG unless it seems medically necessary.
Okay. Thank you, Guy. We had another question that came in beforehand. So I'm going to switch over to some of those, and then I'll go back to some of the other ones in the chat. One is, how long does one need to be practicing HRV training before they feel any different or notice any changes?
Sure, great question. So we could see in that one case study that 6 sessions, so 6 weeks roughly, no, actually it would have been 3 weeks because we were doing 2 sessions a week, so 3 weeks, we had a very significant change in the autonomic nervous system response. And I would say that's maybe a little unusual, especially for a system that was so dysregulated. To a certain degree, part of the how long has to do with the why. What's the cause of the disruption to the autonomic nervous system? And so that's going to have some bearing. So maybe the most challenging is complex PTSD, and trying to get the nervous system to move in the direction of greater harmony in the presence of complex PTSD is challenging. And as a clinician, we want to take that slowly. Trying to move a person too fast can actually lead to kind of an abreaction. And so we don't want that. That has to do with just kind of the change in the brain level, what happens in the neurocircuitry in complex PTSD. And we don't want to get the body at odds with the brain in terms of the wiring. So we want to make sure that we're not trying to move the autonomic nervous system out of sync with the central nervous system. But so that's again, complex PTSD. But I would say we can see changes, sometimes within a single session, again, depending on the relative health within the person, we can see it shift. The goal, though, is, of course, we want to train the autonomic nervous system to do this to do it automatically, and not just when we're doing our practice. So the way a practice goes is we might ask somebody to breathe at, say, 6 breaths per minute, right? So 6 breaths per minute is the median kind of normative breath rate for an adult. So the range is considered to be 4 breaths per minute to 7 breaths per minute is kind of a normative range for an adult to have what's called their resonant frequency. And I'll talk a little bit more about what a resonant frequency is. But for just a kind of a simple at-home practice, let's say we're going to start you at 6 breaths per minute, just because that's the median number for an adult. So it's a good starting place. So you're going to do a practice. Let's say you're going to do 20 minutes a day of paced breathing. So you have you can download on your smartphone a free breath pacer that is like the binging sound that we turned off, right? But you can get different sounds, ones that are less annoying. Find something that you like, but it will pace your breathing and tell you how long to inhale and how long to exhale. So then, you set a timer on your phone, you practice your paced breathing for 20 minutes, and you do that daily for something like 3 to 4 weeks. And then we would ask a person to start to generalize that to do a minute of paced breathing, maybe when you're talking on the phone, or if you're, sitting on the deck watching the garden, take a minute and do a minute of paced breathing. If you're sitting at a stoplight, do 30 seconds of paced breathing. So you generalize it so that you're teaching your autonomic nervous system how to self-regulate in multiple environments. And the idea being that we want this to be an automatic process, that whenever our nervous system feels that it's moving out of regulation, that this system kicks in and moves us back into regulation. And so that's the idea of a HRV home practice, is to retrain the system. Now you could continue doing your practice every day, kind of like a meditation practice, and that's perfectly fine. But I'd say the more important part is the generalizing it, so that you train your system to just, when it's feeling like it's moving outside of its window of tolerance, when it's moving outside of its optimal zone, that it just automatically starts to move back towards optimal. So that's really what we want to see happen from an HRV home practice. So our generic would be 20 minutes a day for 3 to 4 weeks, then start generalizing. At that point, if things feel like they're going well, you could stop the everyday practice and just do that generalized practice, a minute here, a minute there, and continue that, for as long as you care to. But again, you don't have to stop the 20. I think it's a perfectly good thing to be doing, but many people are looking for less to do in their life and not more to do. And so we want to give permission to take this on as a short-term practice to correct a process that should be automatic. Right? That's really our goal, is that piece.
Okay, great. So, yeah, that was actually one of the questions that I received, was talking about ranges and normal ranges. And you mentioned 6 breaths as kind of that median range. Is that different for a teenager, and is it different for someone, say, like over 50 or in her 60s? Is there a difference over age?
Yep, great question. So yes, so children, so we'll say preteen, and then someplace in teen, wherever that crossover is, where we kind of say this nervous system, has matured and is now more of an adult nervous system. So our teenage years, there's a little bit of transition, but for children, a normal breath rate, resting breath rate, would be something like 20 breaths per minute, right? Like that would be normal for a child. For an adult, that's hyperventilation. So our child breathing at 20, 25 breaths per minute, that's fine. If we're going to give them a heart rate variability practice to do, we might have them breathing at 12 or 15 breaths per minute, and that would be perfectly fine to do. We might slow that down, but if we were going to, I would want to be doing that with with the clinical level monitoring, so that we see that what's happening is that it's actually having a regulating effect and not a dysregulating effect. So for children, the range is faster. Then you can imagine, as we move through our teenage years, we again making our physiology is making that transition. Part of your breath rate has literally to do with the size of your body. It's the amount of vasculature and what it takes for your cardiopulmonary system to supply the metabolism of a larger body. So part of what happens when we go from childhood to adult is we get bigger. Someplace in our teenage years, we hit our physical size, and that's where you're going to move into an HRV that is more about your adult HRV, has as much to do with your size as it does with your age, right? So it isn't so much just a chronological, it has to do with your physical size. So so as you move through your teenage years, we might expect that breath rate to start slowing down. And again, these are all kind of at rest breathing rates, right? So if we say 6 is your breath rate, that is not 6 breaths per minute when you're up walking around or doing an activity. Like, you definitely don't want to be out for your speed walking and be breathing at 6 breaths per minute, right? That's a recipe for disaster. So these are resting breath rates for your autonomic nervous system to meet metabolic demand at rest. And so we generally have the general sense that your resonant frequency, so maybe I'll say a little bit about resonant frequency. Once you hit adulthood, your resonant frequency stays the same across your lifespan. We don't expect much change. Where other biological metrics, we might say, you know, a 70-year-old isn't expected to have the same as a 30-year-old. Your resonant frequency, we do generally have the sense, the data supports that stays consistent across a lifespan. So resonant frequency is the breath rate at which your cardiac rhythm, so that HRV red tracing we were looking at, and your respiratory rate or respiratory rhythm, that green tracing, when those two come into that most coherence, the most harmony between your cardiac rhythm and your respiratory rhythm. But then we add to that what's called the baroreflex. And the baroreflex is what controls blood pressure. So that's literally a little you know, kind of bit of neurologic tissue that's measuring the diameter of your vasculature, right? So how constricted or open is your vasculature? So that's your baroreflex. So these three things are the things we're looking at that come together that make up your resonant frequency for breathing. So we have kind of optimal autonomic nervous system function through the window of HRV when our cardiac rhythm, our respiratory rhythm, and our baroreflex come into harmony with one another. And so that on average, that's 6 breaths per minute for an adult. But for you as an individual, it could be 5.5 breaths per minute, or 5, or 4.3, or it could go in the other direction. You might be a 7.2 breaths per minute, and that's your resonant frequency. And that's where you're going to find kind of that optimal harmony within your autonomic nervous system. So this is why I think there's value in doing a resonant frequency determination, is to find out what your actual resonant frequency is. So you do your practice at your frequency. That's going to give you the best outcome. So if you're guessing and doing a 6, chances are, that's fine, but you just want to recognize that you're getting some fraction of the benefit, right? So it might be you're getting 90% of the benefit, or 80% of the benefit, or 70% of the benefit. The way to get 100% of the benefit is you need to know that resonant frequency. And I'll just add another piece to that, which is, again, where do we see this having the most clinical value is for people who are dysregulated. So people who have anxiety, people who have PTSD, people whose nervous system is dysregulated. And the challenge is when you start to regulate the nervous system of somebody whose nervous system is dysregulated, you can have an abreaction, right? So in somebody with significant anxiety, doing heart rate variability breathing can cause a panic attack. And so in those cases, that person really isn't going to want to jump right to their resonant frequency. So an anxious person is probably breathing up in the 20, 25 breaths per minute. And that's hyperventilation. It's not that uncommon. I see it. Probably 70% of the people I test in the clinic are in the hyperventilation. That's just their distracted breathing. Right? So we want to take that person from maybe 20 breaths per minute down to 15, and then to 12, and then to 10, and then to 8, and then to 6, so that we don't jump them from 20 to 6 all in one step. Now, if a person is fairly well regulated and healthy, their system has a lot of resilience, that's not a problem. But from a clinical standpoint, we're usually using HRV as an intervention for the person whose system is significantly dysregulated. And that's where we want to step it down a little bit at a time so we don't cause an abreaction. And so I say that to all of you, if you're thinking about doing this yourself, you might want to know something about your nervous system and how resilient, how flexible it is. And do you jump right to 6, or do you kind of taper yourself down and kind of monitor, your own nervous system, right? Like, that's the nice thing is, even though we have all this fancy equipment to do this, we all have the capacity to actually notice this within ourselves. And so again, a nice, like a low tech way of doing this at home is, say, do a practice at 10 breaths and see how that feels. And then use that feeling, that's your biofeedback to yourself.
Oh, hi. Okay.
Yep.
So I wanted to make sure I get to a couple of these questions, and I know
Please.
we're running out of time at this point. So being mindful of the time, one question is, will inverse measures of coherence lead to CVD?
So cardiovascular disease. So again, we can't really predict if somebody's heart rate variability is low, or in this case, their coherence is low. So autonomic harmony is low. We can't predict, what system is going to be most compromised by that suboptimal, like day-to-day suboptimal function in the autonomic nervous system. So could it be cardiovascular disease? Yes. But is there any way to know that based on the numbers we looked at, including like looking at coherence? No. And honestly, it could be just as easy that person is going to develop type 2 diabetes, or that person is going to have a greater likelihood of cancer, or fill in the blank of any other degenerative disease that we suspect has a strong correlation to suboptimal functioning in the autonomic nervous system. So we can't really predict the disease.
So I just want to make a note here. We're right almost at our 1 o'clock time frame in Eastern time. I'm going to invite everyone who wishes to go ahead and stay and stick around, maybe for the next, I'd say, 4 minutes, and we can get to the rest of these questions. Does that sound okay? You're more than welcome to stick around. We have about 4 more minutes, and I understand if anybody has to log out, that is okay too. How does that sound for you, Guy?
Perfect.
Okay,
Yep.
great. So one thing a question is kind of important. What are contraindications for doing this sort of training? Heart conditions or pacemakers, do those ever factor in? Arrhythmia? What is happening in it with a contraindication?
Sure. So another good question. So the main contraindication is the one that I spoke to, which is the nervous system that is resistant to be regulated, and a person has like an abreaction, which is more like having an anxiety attack or something. Like, it can come out in different ways, but the anxiety attack is kind of a generic sense. There's a resistance in the nervous system to being regulated. So that's our main contraindication. As far as the things that you asked about, if a person has kind of valve issues or a pacemaker, these are actually not contraindications. These are places where we use this specifically. And so it can be great for regulating blood pressure. It can be great for regulating the negative effects of having an irregular heartbeat, if there's a mitral valve prolapse or something of that nature. So all of those concerns, I would say, like, no, those are reasons to do this. Okay. The main contraindication is more the abreaction for the nervous system that doesn't know how to be regulated. And that doesn't mean don't do it. It just means that there needs to be caution around that and holding around that to help that person learn how to be regulated. Okay.
And so since we're kind of running low on our time, I do want to get to maybe any at-home wearables you might recommend. Is the first portion, do you recommend anything that we could use at home on our own? And the second one is, are there any good books? Are there books that we can learn on our own that you might recommend as well? So maybe speak to something along those lines. I had this one guy, he wrote a question in, is HRV just for the tech obsessed biohacker, or is this for everyone? And I can
love it.
relate to that.
Yep. Yeah. So you don't need a lot of tech to do this. You can be completely low tech and have it be as effective or more effective. Because again, the wearables can be just as misleading as helpful. So I'm not a huge fan of the wearables to do health related HRV. So you've got things like heart mass interbalance. What I like about interbalance is it's going to track two metrics. So at least you have two metrics. One of the metrics, though, what it's going to give you is coherence. And as we've seen, coherence can be misleading. You can have really good coherence and the rest of your autonomic nervous system be dysregulated. And if you're just taking your coherence as your indicator, you think, oh, I'm great, I'm winning. So we've not found coherence in the clinic to be a meaningful measure on its own, and quite opposite, we find it gives people disinformation. So it's really hard to find a wearable that gives you enough information to really guide your health. Again, if you're healthy, fantastic, but then you don't really care. If you're trying to move towards a healthier system, a more regulated system, then I would say the information that you've got here, in terms of where, I don't have a favorite book, but I have a favorite presenter. So Dr. Richard Gevirtz. So Dr. Richard Gevirtz, he's got a number of YouTube videos out there. He's fantastic. He talks through the science of it, but in an approachable way. He'll talk through a lot of the pro cons, the whys. So he's one of my main go-tos for when people want to know more information on heart rate variability is Dr. Richard Gevirtz. Plenty out there on him and his writings, articles, blogs, his clinical website. Let's see. So an at-home practice. So what I give my clients to do as an at-home practice is download a breath pacer app on your smartphone or on your iPad or on your desktop. So whatever you have for something. And if you don't have that, get a metronome or just count, right? We can make it as low tech as you want, but it's nice to have a pacer. Set that pacer for a 5-second inhale and a 5-second exhale. That's your 6 breaths per minute. 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. And then just follow that pacer, and that's it. So again, low tech on your own, count, 1001, 1002, 1003 silently in your head for 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. Or use an external pacer. And then if you want to step it up one is you can get some attachments for your smartphone that will collect some data, like heart rate data, that can give you that like little bit more if you want to add technology to your practice, but you don't need to. It can be that simple.
Wonderful.
So 20 minutes a day, 6 breaths per minute. Notice how your nervous system feels. Adjust that breath pace, either a little faster, a little lower, slower, see how that feels. If you find a little faster feels better, then maybe go a little bit faster and see if that's even better. Right? And
Awesome. Great. Do you hold your breath at the top of the inhale or bottom of the exhale?
so for HRV breathing, we don't do holds. And there's a whole lot of, breathing modalities out there. There's yoga, pranayama, there's Wim Hof that have all these different types of breathing, recipes for how long is the inhale, how long is the hold at the top, how long is the exhale, how long is the hold at the bottom. And I'm a fan of all of those, but for HRV, we just do an inhale, exhale with a natural pause that you would just normally have in your breathing, but no intended hold at the top or the bottom. So
Awesome.
Yep.
So thanks for the clarifications on all of that. I'll probably log off and start practicing a little bit of breathing in and out at a pace. So I'm really excited about that. But we're officially out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much to Guy Odishaw for being here today. And of course, thanks for everybody for coming. Resources will be emailed out. So is the recording. I do want to give a shout out to a donor who graciously and generously donated $250 for today's BioBite. So as you know, the Marion Institute operates on generosity. So deep bow of gratitude for the gentleman who donated. So we appreciate all of it. We appreciate all of you, and we'll see you again this time in August, not July, for the next BioBites. So take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks.